is So Much Fun. I'm Colleen Murphy and I teach sewing. But in addition to teaching sewing, I also do long arm quilting. So today I thought I would demonstrate what I do when someone gives me a quilt from the beginning to the end. I think you'll find it interesting. Okay, first we're going to start out explaining what you're seeing. You have poles, and the pole that's on top is what we use for the backing to wrap around. This middle pole is what divides the backing from the top, and the bottom pole is for the top. Sounds complicated, but as you see what we do, it'll make more sense to you. So first of all, I pin the top first. And when I pin the top first, which I've already done here, you have to make sure that you have a center point. So you mark the center of your top, so you make sure you get it evenly spaced on the bar. And you have special pins that you use. They're a little bit heavier pins that you use, and you're just pinning it on to the leader cloth, if you want to call it that. Now, once I get it pinned on, then I roll it. All right, I have one end of the top pinned. Now I'm going to roll it. And I'm just going to turn the wheel that's at the end of the pole, keep turning it so it'll wrap around that bottom pole there. And I'll let that go. Now the next step will be to pin the backing. Now I'm going to bring the leader cloth up for the backing. And when I do, I take it between these two top poles, wrap it over the top one, and I'm going to secure them on each end so I have a surface that I can pin. When you pin, whether it's the top or the backing, you always begin in the center. You don't start at one end and work yourself over to the other. And so I'm just going to take that edge, and you make sure for the backing that it's wrong side up. For the top, it's right side up. So I'm just going to match up my fabric with my leader cloth. Again, I start at the center. Not only do I start at the center, I put the pins that are on the left side facing the left, and then when I pin from the center to the right, I pin in a direction to the right. So we don't ever go in just one direction. Again, it's to keep it perfectly spaced. And it doesn't take but just a few minutes to get those pins in. And I do use different pins for the backing than I do for the top. I don't know why, I can't give you an explanation, but that's what I do. And you want to make sure when you're putting the fabric onto the Gammill, I don't think I even mentioned that this is a Gammill 2210, that's the model number. And what that means is, the 22 means that the throat space is 22 inches. And the 10 means I'm using a 10-foot table. So I cannot do a king size quilt. I can't go any larger than a queen. And very seldom do I have anyone that has a need for a larger size than a queen. Most of the time, the quilts I get are lap size. Not always, but I'd say most of the time, like I said. Occasionally, I'll get one like this, which what I would consider to be a baby quilt. So again, I'm just pinning these. I'm just pinning the backing to the left direction, and when I finish, then I'll switch and go to the right. And you have to do this at both ends of the fabric, at the bottom and then at the top. Another thing you want to think about when you're doing this, and unfortunately, one time only, it was a directional print of the backing going the opposite direction than the top. So you always want to make sure your direction is correct, whichever way you want to go. So I have magnetic dishes here so I can let them sit right on the poles as I pin. Makes it go a little bit faster. And I have my leader cloth marked where the center is, so that I can line up the center of the backing and the center of the top to make sure they're going to be okay. And I tell everyone, whenever you want to have a quilt done on a long arm, the backing needs to be 10 inches bigger than the top. So that means both directions too. So if your quilt is 50 by 70, then that means the backing has to be 60 by 80. You need that extra because of the poles. The fabric has to wrap around the poles, and that takes up part of the fabric. And then the reason we want it wider than the top, sometimes you need to test it out for the tension to see if you've got the correct tension and the threading is okay. So you can't have it be exactly the same. So 10 inches more than whatever the top is. And I will say sometimes people cheat a little bit, and I usually can get by, but it isn't very easy if you have less on your backing than you do your top. Now I'm going to roll the backing onto that bottom pole. Just roll it, and you have to make sure as you do it that if you've got a crease or a wrinkle in there, you kind of want to move your fabric so it's nice and smooth. You just check it as you roll it. For some of the big quilts, I may get a couple of people to help me out. It'll run a lot smoother than if I do it by myself. I'm going to roll this up, and obviously this is a lot more than what I need, but that's all right. I'd rather have more than less. A whole lot more here. Okay. Now it's time. I'm going to pin the other end of the backing. So I bring the fabric under the pole, bring it to the top, and I'm going to bring the take-up pole, the leader on it. I need to let it out. And I want to keep that nice and flat, so I'm going to put a clamp on there. I figure on at least an hour to get a quilt on the Gammill. I never know if there's going to be any issues, but by the time I pin it and roll it, many times I need to press the fabric, and I want to get this pin that marks the center matched up with the center point on the take-up leader cloth. And I'll start to pin this on. All right, now that I have the front end or the top end of the backing pinned, I'm going to roll the take-up leader so that I have maximum space. So I take it right up to the very edge, and then I'm going to lock that in place, nice and taut. Now I'm putting the batting on top of the backing, and I just slide it in between the two poles. Just tuck it in there. And if the batting is an inch or two wider than the backing, that's okay, but I don't want it to be any more than that. And a lot of times I'll cut the batting so it's more of the size of the backing. I don't want too much excess on each side. Once I get it smoothed out on top of the backing, then I'm going to put some pins temporarily. They're not going to stay in, but I need to pin it before I run the Gammill to stitch a row so that the batting and the backing are together. So it's just every 3 or 4 or 5 inches. It's very random that I put the pins in to keep that from shifting before I put the top up. Put it on top of the batting and the backing. So in addition to pinning across the top, then on the sides you have two straps that have clamps. And so those help keep it taut. Now you can see that the difference in using a long arm versus quilting on a sewing machine. On a sewing machine, you move the fabric to direct your stitches. With a long arm, you don't move the fabric. Instead, you move the head, if you call it, of the long arm. The fabric is stationary, which is just reverse if you were trying to quilt using a sewing machine. Whenever you're quilting on a long arm, you always go from the left to the right. The first time I did a quilt many years ago, this is actually my third quilting machine, I thought you go left to right and then you go right to left. Can't do that. You would create an obvious change in the fabric, and we don't want to do that. Okay, I have the Gammill on, and on the screen I want to make some changes. First off, I'm going to clear what I did from the last quilt. I'm going to change the time back to 0. I'm going to change the number of stitches back to 0 and then get out of that. And then I also set it for needle down. Essentially, that's what it amounts to, that when you start the machine, and any time that you stop the machine, the needle will be down and not up. Now the next thing is we're going to do a basting stitch all the way across the top of the backing, and I want it to be perfectly straight. So the Gammill is really nice because I have a horizontal lock and a vertical lock. And so I'm going to use the horizontal lock because that line will be my guide for bringing the top over and getting it even all the way across. So I'm going to lock it in, and now I'm going to bring up my bobbin thread. Just a little bit, bring that thread up. And I'm going to change the stitching from regulate to basting. So I'm going to keep touching the panel until it says basting. All right, now here we go. I'm going to start and just go across. And this is going to be a perfectly straight line. So that makes it easy when you're trying to position the top, that you know you'll get it perfectly straight. I have people who are now into modern quilting, and they want to have horizontal rows of stitching. I don't like to do it any closer than 1 inch apart, but it's a little time consuming, but it's pretty easy on the Gammill. You just lock it into whatever position you want and just move the Gammill, and it's going to do a perfectly straight line. Now we're at the end, and I'm going to stop it and turn off the horizontal lock, move it aside, and cut the thread. All right, now I'm going to take out the pins and bring up the top. So I'm bringing the top up to that line that I just stitched. You can see it on the batting. And then I need to temporarily pin it in place. Not like I did when I pinned the back or the end of the top. I'm going to do it like I did the batting. I'm just going to scatter some pins across the top, out of the way from where I'm going to stitch, and then I'm going to baste across there. Now, before I even start running it, I check the top to see if there are any loose threads or there are threads in the seam that the quilter might have missed. This one looks exceptionally good, and I don't have to do that. So now I'm ready to start quilting. So again, I'm going to touch the bullseye here on the screen, and I'm ready to go. I try to make it random. I don't want to cross over any line. I try to watch it to make sure I don't cross a line. I guess it isn't an absolute, but I just prefer not to do that. When you finish, you have to roll the quilt. So I'm going to release the two poles, one for the backing and one for the top. And with the take-up lever, I have a crank and I can turn it. I can turn it just enough so I can start again. Before I can though, I want to make sure everything is smooth. And the first thing will be tightening the backing before you tighten the top. I'm just reaching underneath, making sure it's all smooth. Then I turn the wheel for the backing, get it taut, and lock it in place. And then I do that for the top. Once that's done, then I put the clamps back on each side. Now that I'm near the end of the quilt, I want to secure the top to the backing and not to the leader cloth. So I'm going to start here on the left side, and I'm just going to sew down the edge less than 1/4 of an inch. And then I'm going to gradually go across the bottom edge, and it doesn't have to be straight. Remember, the goal is to stay less than 1/4 of an inch. And I take out about 3 pins at a time. I don't remove all of them. I'll just remove a few at a time. And I'm going to repeat this. So I'll go all the way across the bottom of the quilt top before I go back and finish quilting the rest of the quilt. Now that I'm finished quilting, then all I have left to do is to remove the quilt from the Gammill. I'll just cut straight across here and take the quilt over to the sewing room and trim up and square up the edges for the quilter to be able to put on her binding. Now that you've seen this video, you have a pretty good idea of what the differences are in using a long arm quilter versus trying to do quilting on a standard sewing machine. There's a lot to it, but once you get the hang of it, it's a lot of fun. So be sure to subscribe and have so much fun.